It just becomes hidden as part of the background. It's the same idea. So is the gospel, and have we allowed the gospel in our familiarity with it in our culture, and some of the things we take for granted, especially morality in a sense of right and wrong, do we take those things for granted because we're so tired of the gospel we no longer even see it any longer? Where this was so new and so antithetical to what was going on for this tribe and how they developed as a people group. Is it the tribe's fault? No. Does our culture bear responsibility for our own blindness? Yes, we do. So the group in there, the organization that sponsored this couple originally was called New Tribes Mission. Founded in 1942 by a guy named Paul Fleming. Also, not necessarily professionally or seminary trained, just a layman who got together who had a burning passion on his heart to go do something really cool and special. And they've done lots of work around the world. But as time's gone by, they've changed their name and it has evolved to the name Ethnos 360. 360 you get because 360 degrees, full circle, right? What does ethnos mean? Does anyone know? It's a Greek term. No. No. That's pistis. No, but it's not. Ethnos means nations or people groups. So it's the ethnos, the people. So in other words, it's still people groups around the world. New Tribes Missions. I mean, they make a link, but it's just play off of a Greek word.
So can you just mention again, for the sake of the video, that we just watched Eat How, and that I'll put a link up next.
Yeah. So for the folks out there in the virtual world, we just finished watching a short clip called Eat How. Eat How means "let it be" or "it is true." It's equivalent to us saying "Amen" today. But the link to that video will be in the description. You can go watch that, and it makes the rest of this discussion make much more sense. So one of those comments I thought was really interesting that the host in there was saying, and this isn't a direct quote, but it gets the idea. What you believe drives what you do. Talk to me about that for a moment. Why is that the case? Or is that in fact a true statement? What do you think, Russell? Does what you believe about anything drive the way you interact? Yeah, right? So I'll put my daughter on the spot momentarily. Just a moment. So I'm going to make an assumption that you love me as your dad, right? Yeah? Okay. So as you make decisions and choices of what to do around the house as you go outside the house, does your love of me impact those decisions? Yeah, probably, because otherwise if you do things I don't think are appropriate, I get it. Right, but I tend to get upset when you don't do the things I think are appropriate, right? No, you haven't. I'm just making a point, right? So I know the fact that I love my bride over there, and so the way I interact with other people, especially other women, is going to be I'm going to behave a certain way so that I don't dishonor her, because. So the things we believe impact what we do. If we believe that Jesus is Lord, that He is coming again, that He's going to reorganize the world order and establish a kingdom that will have no end, that the dwelling of God is finally with man, would that not in fact affect how we behave today in anticipation of a future reality? It should. It should. Does the New Testament and the Bible as a whole teach us what right and good behavior is supposed to look like? It gives us, there's some great freedoms in there. right? There's a whole discussion on whether alcohol or tobacco is permissible or not, right? And various people have various convictions over that. But there are things that are very clear, and there are things that are very crystal clear that say this is inappropriate and this is appropriate, right? If the Bible teaches something, regardless of what that teaching is, where does the burden lie for saying that, oh, that was cultural practice, or that was a time for that period, or no, that's still applicable today? Where's the burden lie if a Bible teaches something explicitly? It does on interpretation, which means it's on the person reading it or teaching it, right? Because the Scriptures is the authority of itself. That's an assumption we as believers have. It's an assumption that we as conservative, Orthodox, evangelical Christians take for granted, that we just assume that the Bible is accurate in what it says, right? It's a fair assumption. There's some good work and there's some good academic behind that reasoning, and we just don't have time for that today. But that, just take it, at least for me at this moment, that's an assumption that we make. It's a presupposition we come to the Scriptures with. How did God first reveal himself to humanity? He walked on the earth. So how did the New Tribes Missions present God to the the Mauk people? It started with that very story in teaching, because he very briefly made mention of the relationship between Cain and Abel, what a good and acceptable sacrifice is not, and things of that nature. So they had to start with Adam and Eve and talk through that, and the whole idea of creation, because they said they had a belief that they were created by a pair of birds, right? And so there's creation stories in every single nation, every people group, every ethnos has its creation stories. And so, what did, is his name Mark? Was the guy named Mark? Is it remembering correctly? Okay, so how did Mark start with these people and trying to describe ultimately trying to describe the gospel to them? Yeah, he had to learn their culture, right? Because you wanted to be able to speak from a point of commonality, right? When we meet someone new, even today, like when you meet somebody new, what are some of the first things we ask when you meet somebody new? Other than just introducing yourself. What are some of the things you try to discover about people?
Their family.
Yeah, where the family is, where they're from, typically. What else? Hobbies. Yeah, hobbies and what they do for work and occupation, absolutely. Why do we do such things? Yes, we're looking for overlap and connections. The first time I met Dave, I was like, oh, you're from Michigan. Yeah, oh, Midwest. Okay, yeah, I had a friend that was from Wisconsin. I've never been up there myself, but I had a connection to him through another friend of mine. And it wasn't even that he even knows the Winquists. It's the fact that they were both from the same general geographic area, because we want to find those connections, right? So what Mark was doing with the Mauk people was learning their culture so he could find connections. Now the question then becomes, does anybody know the term synchronization? Syncretization, excuse me. This is a very particular word among missionaries. Some see it as bad, some see it as not necessarily an issue. It's in the end, probably the worst definition of it, or the worst case scenario is a blending of the new culture with the gospel to create something kind of a hybrid type environment. And that's not necessarily what should be done, but are there elements of syncretization even in our culture? Which is what? And most poignantly, right? So Christmas, Germanic in origin, or at least in far northern Europe in origin, and had more of a pagan time. So is it wrong to celebrate the birth of Christ on Christmas? Because Christmas's original origin. Some would say. I would say they're wrong. No, I don't think there's a problem with it at all. Is it proper to celebrate the birth of Christ into creation? To come into history? Absolutely. So why not take an event that was already culturally important to a group of people at some point in time, and let's redefine that, redeem that event, give it new meaning in order to celebrate and teach good theology. Nothing wrong with that. That is not the point of synchronization that we're talking about. That we're taking something that's already existent, redefining it, putting new meaning to it, so that it becomes a better teaching tool. That's all celebrations are. Different feasts and celebrations in any culture are to teach something. That's the only reason they exist. What did the Feast of Passover teach? The Exodus, right? What does the Feast of Booths teach? Does anybody know? Yeah, they're wandering for the 4 years. What was the other one? I forget what it's called. Where it's to celebrate the harvest that God has provided. Darn it. Oh well. But anyways, the various feasts that God commands the people to celebrate are to remind and teach and to review how He has interacted with them over time. Correct? Absolutely. And every culture has those kind of things. So if we want to do something, and if we go into the Mauk people and stuff like that, they're going to have certain celebrations. Are they going to learn what Christmas is, what Easter is? Absolutely. It's so quintessential and so essential to the Christian faith now that these are things we're going to transport into other cultures. But is there a sense of taking an existent celebration and maybe putting some new definitions and new understanding to that to bring out an aspect of their new Christian faith? Likely. Is that a bad thing? Some would say yes, and some would say no, as long as it's done the right way. So there's this. I think it was William Carey who went to inland China.
Are you talking about Hudson Taylor?
Hudson Taylor,
William
thank
Carey
you.
was like the modern...
Right. You're right, Hudson Taylor. I apologize. So Hudson Taylor went for, was a China Inland Mission type thing. He went in there, but he was accused of the bad form of this synchronization because when he got there, he started dressing like them. He took on kind of their wearing appearance of their hair and everything. So he looked like he assumed their culture. And other people came in and was like, you shouldn't do that. And he goes, why not? I'm in their culture. And I want to show them how Christ impacts their culture. Why don't I look like them? I think Hudson Taylor was accurate in his approach. I don't think there's a problem with that at all. As I go around, it says, the Army's taking me different places, right? I can get away with jeans and a short sleeve shirt. Or I could probably even get away even on video with shorts in our congregation, right? But we go back to something like Southeast United States and a very traditional service, I'd be hard-pressed to get away without a tie, let alone a coat in that swampy environment. And so there's different expectations of what is appropriate, and we just have to know what those are, and we don't want to be a stumbling block to prevent people from knowing and learning the gospel just because we don't like an aspect of that group's culture, right? So if it doesn't impact theology, it's not worth even fighting. Just accept it as it is. Don't change it just because it doesn't hit our particular preferences. And that's the biggest thing. We need to understand the difference between our preferences versus what's actually worth falling on swords for. Right? So how did the revelation of God evolve over time? Let's go to that question. How did Mark present that?
Start with how it came?
Yeah.
In the Old Testament first?
start with the Old Testament and how God revealed himself to Adam and Eve, how then ultimately how he reveals himself to Abraham and his requirements of Abraham. He goes through things. What have we been doing over the last several months? The very same thing. We have to start with the foundation of how God has revealed himself, right? We can't, let me rephrase. We must begin with where God has worked and how God has revealed himself over time. If we fail to do that, it's too easy for us to impose assumptions and assumed facts where there aren't really. And so we just have to be careful with it. We fight that all the time, don't get me wrong. We always have to continue to make sure that we take the scriptures at its word, and when the scriptures are silent, we have to recognize that it's silent and I'm inputting XYZ in that silence to make it make sense to me. But I have to recognize where I've done that, and we all have to. Sometimes we're good at that, sometimes we're not so good at that, right? But as we have worked our way through the Old Testament, we have come to the point that there really was no new revelation after. This is a bit overspoken. There's no real new revelation or new requirements of God on the people after the covenant made with David. That was the end of the covenants. That solidified the old covenant. Now, so if that's the case, there were between David and Christ was how many years? Does anybody know generally? It's 1,000. About 1,000. It's okay, you're close. There was 400 years of silence after Malachi. So the last prophet of the Old Testament was Malachi, 400 years. But the really last prophet, and that Jesus says was the greatest of all these, was John the Baptist. And he was the last one of that tradition. But what did those prophets do? What was their primary purpose in their teaching, preaching, and exhortation? As correction of behavior, right? So there's an ethical requirement to being obedient and devoted follower of God. What else? Let me put it this way. Was the primary message of the prophets either pre or post-exilic? What are they giving new information about God? Was that their primary message?
Well, Christ said that they were revealing him.
There's that. But primarily, they're not giving anything new. They're giving application of what has already been revealed. They're calling people back. But in that application, we start to see hints of things that are to come. We have hints from Daniel that there's something greater coming. We have passages out of Amos that declares a great calamity and an apocalypse that is at the end of the age, where God will set all things right, that justice and peace will reign, that there's clearly a dissatisfaction with the current norm. You have things out of Isaiah. There's a small section in there that has kind of this apocalyptic, calamitous nature of seeing something at the end of time where God comes in and reorganizes and resets the board, if you will. And so we see those kind of things. And so as we get in, but those are only hints of things that has come through, but the primary role of the prophet is a forthtelling of truth. It is calling people to come and be obedient before what has already been known. It's the primary role of pastors today. There's a handful of things of a foretelling, of predicting what will come. So one of the things that my current studies has brought me to, that there's actually a distinction. I didn't know this until I started going to class, because our education in our respective seminaries, we just didn't spend a whole lot of time in this type of literature. But is there a difference between so when I say eschatological or eschatology, what am I talking about? at end times, right? There's something going on. So under eschatology, you have two subsets under eschatology. One is prophetic and one is apocalyptic. Does anyone know what the difference is? They both look forward, but what's the difference between the two?
Apocalyptic's like end of the world.
Yeah, it's calamitous, end of the world, end of age, reset, and just an absolute inbreaking of God into history and into time.
Are you talking also that that's future?
Yeah, it's entirely future, because the apocalypse has yet to happen. So it was future then, it's still future now. Prophetic is God's working in history within the current timeline, using the current nations to accomplish his work. We were speaking briefly beforehand, just the way Hawaii was prepped for the gospel and the different things, and how Kamehameha here unified the islands to bring some kind of commonality. Some of the things that happened at the advent of Christ, who was prior to Christ's time, who was the reigning empire, ever so briefly, that unified the known world? Alexander the Great. So he's Greek, and he had this whole sense of Hellenization. Alexander didn't just want to rule, he wanted to change cultures. He wanted to transplant Greek culture to the world. And his influence stretched from Alexandria, Egypt. He kept renaming cities after himself. The guy was pompous. But you got Alexandria, Egypt, all the way to present Mongol. And so he conquered all that quick, and he spread Greek. So by the time of Jesus' time period, the common economic language, the business language of the time, was Greek. Because, granted, Rome was in charge at that point, power had transitioned, but Greek had taken over. Greek was the common. What is in the 15, 16, 17, even up to the 1800s, what was the common business language around the world? And around at least the Western world? It's French. And then the common business language today is English, primarily because of the role of the United States. The English is the common business language, not even in the West, but around the world. And in fact, what is all of when we do money transfers and we transfer exchange rates, it's based off of what currency? What is the baseline currency for the world? It is the American dollar. So, and that's one of the great struggles we're facing with China right now. We have various countries who are accepting that the yuan, the Chinese yuan, would be the baseline currency. And so there's an economic struggle going between us and China right now. Who's actually going to control the economy of the world? It's huge, because that's power, right? So where are we going with that? Then Rome comes in, right? So Israel was controlled by Alexander. Israel was a crossroads of, we've got to stop. It's 10 o'clock. Yeah, we've lost our time. In short, Israel was a crossroads. Alexander came over, controlled it, because all the trade lines between the known world crossed through there. That's why it was so particular and so important. It wasn't that they produced anything special. It was just the convergence point of all the key points of power around the world. Alexander dies. The Greek Empire is split up among various generals. Primarily, the ones that influenced Israel most was the power in Alexandria, Egypt, and the one in Syria. The Ptolemies in Alexandria, Egypt, controlled, and then you get the Seleucids in the Assyrian Empire. Ultimately, and these two just banged heads all the time. Ultimately, the Seleucids win. Then you have, and they were trying to impose pagan practice on the Jewish people. They refused to go back to that. That's the one good thing about the post-exilic period. They never went back to false idolatry after that. But then this family called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, the Hammers, rose up to force out the Seleucids. And there was from about 167 BC to about 63 BC, there was some independence. They had some autonomy. And then Rome came and crushed everyone. But one of the things that Rome did was they connected the world through transport. All roads lead to Rome. So now not only do we have a common language, now we have safe passage to move around the known world. And God used these other nations, these other ethnoses, to create the environment that would be most beneficial for the incarnation of Christ to come into the world, and then for the gospel to reach out and spread to every corner therein. It's amazing. That is God working in history as it currently is. That is the fulfillment of prophecy and the work of prophetic literature. Apocalyptic is yet to come. And the challenge we have for Old Testament prophets is sometimes that apocalyptic and that prophetic and the apocalyptic are so, they're seen as one entity, yet we have trouble seeing them different until we get past the point and we say, oh, these are like two different things that we're looking at. So from the perspective of the prophet, he sees it all as one, but as time goes on, we say, oh, that part was prophetic, it's in history, that is still yet to come, that's the great calamity that is yet to come, that God's inbreaking. Because the ultimate goal is to restore what was lost in Eden, that God's dwelling is with man and we are in his presence, that faith, hope, love abide, these three, right? But faith is now seen, hope is fulfilled, but love, the greatest of these, exists forever and will remain. And thus the fulfillment of the great meta-narrative, creation, fall, and recreation. And so that's why we're going through all this, so we can put all this stuff in this wireframe together. So I'm about to start some travel. I'll be leaving. And so I'll be in and out over the next time period, but when we come back, we're going to put a short concentration on this intertestamental period and the development of religious thought and the development of the religious practice and anticipation and expectation of the time that set the stage for Christ coming into our world. It'd be kind of fun to look at. Fair enough? So, and we'll deal with some of the Apocrypha at the time. None of it's scripture, but some of it's historically helpful for us to get some context, to know what was going on in the time period. It's helpful, but we don't want to base our lives on it necessarily. Make sense? All right, cool. Any questions? Cool. Thank you so very much. Let's take a very quick break. Maybe 5 minutes or so. You can grab a quick snack or something like that, and we'll come back. I apologize for going a little bit over.